Imagine a place so silent you can hear your heartbeat echo off concrete. A place where the sun never fully shines, where every breath is measured, and every second is recorded. No riots, no shouts, no mercy, just walls. Welcome to ADX Florence. The end of the line. The world's most secure prison, where America locks away the men it fears the most and pretends they no longer exist. Terrorists, cartel bosses, serial killers, gang kings. Inside these walls, they all live the same way. Alone, silent, unseen. But what happens after years of total isolation? What happens when silence becomes a weapon and control becomes madness? This isn't just a prison. It's the place where time dies. 24 hours inside the world's most secure prison, inside ADX Florence. Welcome to hell built by design. The silence beneath the Rockies. 24 hours inside the world's most secure prison, inside ADX Florence. It begins with silence. Not the kind that soothes, the kind that swallows sound, thought, and time itself. At sunrise in Florence, Colorado, the wind moves across the desert plains with an eerie hiss, sweeping dust against concrete walls that rise like gray monoliths out of nowhere. There's nothing for miles, no neighborhoods, no crowds, no echoes of city life. Just the wind, the barbed wire, and the cold hum of security sensors buried beneath the sand. This is ADX Florence, officially the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility. Unofficially, it's called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Inside, the government houses the men they consider too dangerous, too violent, or too unbreakable for any other place. Terrorists, cartel bosses, gang leaders, and killers, all contained within a single concrete cube designed to erase humanity 1 hour at a time. But today's story isn't about all of them. It's about what it's like to live and survive 24 hours inside the world's most secure prison. The arrival. The convoy arrives just before dawn, unmarked SUVs escorted by federal marshals. Inside the back seat, shackled and silent, sits a man the Bureau of Prisons only identifies as inmate 92137-058. He's been transferred under the highest level of custody, hold at ADX Florence indefinitely, high-risk inmate, communication restricted. According to federal filings, he was once part of a major organized crime network responsible for multiple murders across 2 states. He's already done time in Leavenworth. Survived Marion. Broke a man's jaw in Atlanta. Now he's reached the end of the line. As the vehicle slows before the massive steel gate, guards step forward wearing black tactical gear, visors down, rifles in hand. No one speaks. Orders are given through hand signals. The gates slide open with mechanical precision, revealing a corridor of cameras, sensors, and steel. Every movement is watched. Every sound recorded. The marshals step out, remove the prisoner, and chain him to a waist belt before leading him toward the intake wing. No fingerprints are taken here, those were done long ago. At ADX, they measure your body, your gait, your breathing rhythm. You're not just an inmate. You're a profile, a threat score in a government database. He's stripped, searched, scanned, and photographed under ultraviolet light for contraband detection. His old prison uniform is burned. He's handed new clothing, gray sweats, white t-shirt, soft shoes, no laces, no metal, nothing sharp. Then, without a word, they lead him through 3 sets of sliding doors. Each closes before the next opens. The sound is final, like a coffin lid being sealed. The cell. ADX cells are built for control, not comfort. 7 feet wide, 12 feet long, reinforced concrete walls. A steel door with a narrow slot for food trays. A slit window, only 4 inches wide, angled upward so you can see nothing but the sky. The bed is a concrete slab. The desk and stool are molded from the wall itself. The toilet shuts off automatically if you try to block it. Every feature is a response to something an inmate once did: flood a cell, make a weapon, send a hidden message. According to Bureau of Prisons design notes and court documents, the architecture of ADX was engineered to eliminate all possibilities of defiance. Even communication is engineered out. Walls are soundproof. Ventilation shafts don't connect. Inmates can't shout through pipes, tap codes, or pass messages under doors. Here, silence is not just punishment, it's policy. The morning routine. At 6 a.m., a mechanical buzz echoes down the corridor. It's breakfast time. A tray slides through the door slot, scrambled eggs, bread, powdered milk. Guards never speak, cameras watch as the inmate retrieves the tray, then slides it back out. He eats alone. He always will. Every ADX prisoner spends 23 hours a day inside their cell. The remaining hour, known as recreation, happens in a concrete pen the size of a parking space, surrounded by 20-foot walls and a steel mesh ceiling. If you look straight up, you might catch a glimpse of the Colorado sky. That's your only connection to the world. According to former ADX warden Robert Hood, it's not designed for rehabilitation. It's designed for total control. The mind games begin. By 10 a.m., the silence starts to change shape. For most new inmates, that's when the real punishment begins. No sound means no distraction. No human contact means no feedback, no way to measure time, emotion, or reality. Prison psychologists have documented this effect for years. After weeks in isolation, the brain begins to rewrite itself. Inmates report hearing voices, feeling vibrations in walls, seeing shadows that aren't there. Court filings from Madrid versus Gomez and later Ashker versus Governor described how long-term solitary confinement in Supermax conditions leads to paranoia, self-harm, and hallucinations. In one report, a former ADX inmate wrote, "The silence becomes so loud, you start to hear your heartbeat as a conversation partner." That's the psychological weapon of ADX, the hole behind the hole. Afternoon surveillance. At 1 p.m., the inmate hears a mechanical buzz again. Lunch. Another tray. Another silence. Through a pinhole camera above the door, a guard watches, not out of curiosity, but procedure. Every movement is logged. Each action timed. Each intake recorded. Guards rotate posts every 15 minutes to prevent familiarity. No officer interacts with the same inmate twice in a row. It's by design, to keep emotion out of the equation. Down in the control room, officers monitor hundreds of screens. Each one displays a cell, hallway, or gate. Nothing is left to chance. The prison is so secure that if an inmate managed to escape his cell, which has never been documented, he would still face 12 more locked steel doors, laser motion detectors, and armed towers. According to an FBI report on federal prison security, no one has ever escaped from ADX Florence. Northwest one even came close. Nightfall. As the sun sinks behind the mountains, shadows stretch across the compound. Inside, the lights never truly go out, only dim to a pale fluorescent glow. Dinner comes at 6 p.m. Then, silence again. Outside, coyotes cry in the distance. Inside, the inmate stares at the ceiling, tracing every crack, every flicker of light from the tiny window slit. Somewhere down the hall, another prisoner shouts once, a muffled, human sound swallowed by layers of concrete. Then nothing. Hours pass. He lies still, counting seconds in his head. He doesn't know it yet, but this will be his life, day after day, year after year, in perfect repetition. The hidden cost. For the public, ADX Florence represents safety, the place where America's most dangerous men are kept from ever hurting anyone again. But for those inside, and even those who guard it, the cost is psychological. Former Warden Hood once described it as a clean version of hell. Another guard said in an interview, "We're not just locking them up. We're burying them alive, one day at a time." Federal records confirm that suicides and self-harm incidents have occurred despite the strict surveillance. Mental health lawsuits, including Bacote versus Federal Bureau of Prisons in 2012, forced the institution to implement mandatory psychological screenings and limited out-of-cell therapy. Even then, change came slow. Inside ADX, progress moves at the speed of bureaucracy and silence. Midnight thoughts. By midnight, the inmate has learned the rhythm of his new world. The hum of ventilation. The faint buzz of fluorescent lights. The taste of metal in the air. He's not sure how long he's been awake. In solitary, time stretches, elastic and cruel. You can't tell minutes from hours. Some inmates write imaginary letters in their head. Some replay old conversations. Some count cracks in the wall until morning comes again. He whispers to himself, just to hear another voice. Then he stops, afraid of the echo. The routine of control. The morning starts before sunrise, not for the inmates, but for the institution itself. Every corridor, every control room, every line of sight in ADX Florence operates on precision timing. The entire facility is built around one philosophy: predictability prevents chaos. Inside the control center, a low hum of computers fills the air. Monitors line the walls, each one showing a live feed from one of the 490 surveillance cameras across the compound. Every door movement, every tray pass, every human motion is recorded, archived, and logged. Nothing happens here without record. According to a 2001 Bureau of Prisons operational memo, ADX runs on a 24-hour rotational cycle divided into 7-minute intervals. That's how long it takes for each shift to check every cell, confirm status lights, and rotate security coverage. This ensures that no guard, no inmate, and no corner of the prison ever falls outside a watchful eye. But for the inmates, this routine feels like a slow, mechanical suffocation. The count. At exactly 6 a.m., lights flicker on inside the cells. Each inmate sits upright. They know what's next. A voice echoes through a steel intercom. Stand for count. Feet shuffle. Chains clink. One by one, faces appear in door windows. Guards move down the hall, 2 by 2, one reading names, the other verifying IDs. It's the same sequence every day. No words exchanged. No deviation. If an inmate hesitates, the process restarts. Control isn't just enforced, it's ritualized. Breakfast protocol. 5 minutes later, a mechanical buzz. Trays slide through the food slot: oatmeal, bread, water. Every meal is portioned down to the calorie and scanned for contraband. Utensils are plastic, flexible, and counted before and after every distribution. Guards stand behind reinforced glass, observing. There are no cafeteria lines here, no conversations, no shared spaces. Even at mealtime, ADX keeps human contact to near zero. Communication by design. It's easy to forget that this prison was born from a failure. Before ADX, the Bureau of Prisons tried to manage its most dangerous inmates through isolation wings at facilities like Marion, Illinois and Leavenworth, Kansas. But after riots and murders in the 1980s, including the killing of 2 officers at Marion, the federal government decided to create something new, a facility where no one could reach anyone. The result was Florence, a fortress of psychological architecture. Each inmate's movements are tracked by an electronic system known as the Inmate Accountability Protocol. It logs every motion in real time, synced to a central server deep within the complex. Even when an inmate is escorted, say, for medical check or court appearance, he's cuffed, shackled, and surrounded by multiple officers, each assigned a specific task. One watches his feet. One watches his hands. One watches his face. It's not paranoia. It's procedure. Inside the bubble. In the heart of ADX lies what officers call the bubble. It's a glass-encased control room overlooking multiple housing units, where a handful of officers manage entire pods with the press of a button. From there, they can open cell doors, activate intercoms, release shower units, or trigger lockdowns, all without leaving the room. The inmates rarely see them. But the officers see everything. One guard later told a reporter from the New York Times. We control them like air traffic controllers manage planes. No face-to-face, just screens, radios, and locks. The routine within. By 9 a.m., the prison has reached what the staff call operational stability. Every inmate is in his assigned space. Every gate is sealed. Inside cell D-213, the same man from Chapter 1, inmate 92137-058, sits on his concrete stool, staring at a stack of papers. They're heavily censored letters from his legal counsel, each one inspected line by the prison's Special Investigative Services. He's allowed to write one outgoing letter per week, but even that passes through a multi-step clearance system before it leaves the compound. Phone calls. Maybe once a month, if approved. Visits? Only through bulletproof glass, under surveillance, and limited to 2 hours. No inmate in ADX can touch another human being. Not a guard. Not a visitor. Not another prisoner. Human contact has been engineered out of existence. The psychology of predictability. Researchers who studied ADX have said that its power lies in its consistency. There are no surprises, no change, no spontaneity, no choices. Every motion is timed. Wake up. Eat. Clean. Stand. Sit. Sleep. Repeat. According to Bacote versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, inmates described this repetition as a slow-motion collapse of the mind. One wrote, "You don't go crazy all at once. It's a drip. A day. A sound. A silence. And then one morning, you wake up and the world feels smaller than your cell." Psychologists call it learned helplessness, a condition in which the brain stops trying to adapt because every action is controlled by someone else. At ADX, that's not a side effect. It's the goal. The guard's side. Behind the glass, guards deal with their own kind of isolation. Many officers rotate out after just a few years. Some say the silence affects them too. You spend 8 hours watching men in cages, and you start to feel caged yourself, one officer told the Denver Post. He wasn't exaggerating. There's no camaraderie here, no laughter, no visible emotion. Guards are trained to move without reaction, to maintain absolute neutrality. Even if an inmate screams, taunts, or self-harms, the response is mechanical. Alert. Log. Secure. Report. It's a system that removes empathy to preserve order. And yet, deep down, every guard knows they're part of a place that erases the human condition on both sides of the door. Recreation, the cage. At 11 a.m., the inmate's door buzzes again. It's his 1 hour of recreation. 2 guards appear, instructing him to face the back wall. He kneels, places his hands through the slot, and is cuffed. Then, shackles on his feet. They lead him down the hallway, a maze of concrete, light, and echo. Every 10 feet, a steel door slides open and another slams shut. Finally, he steps into the recreation yard, a small enclosure surrounded by walls higher than a house, with a grated roof that lets sunlight slice through in thin lines. There's no grass, no basketball hoop, no exercise equipment. Just concrete and sky. He walks in circles for 30 minutes, then sits against the wall, staring upward. He doesn't speak. He doesn't have anyone to speak to. Then, just like that, the hour ends. Cuffs back on. Back to the cell. Afternoon silence. By 1 p.m., the building returns to its steady rhythm. Guards perform routine checks. Inmates remain silent. The hum of air vents and fluorescent lights fills the void. It's the only consistent sound. ADX doesn't need physical punishment, the environment itself is punishment. According to former warden Robert Hood, it's a place designed for one thing, to make sure you never forget where you are. And that's the genius of its control. You can't escape the system, but you also can't escape the thought of the system. It lives in your head, minute by minute, hour by hour. Night brief. At the end of the day, guards return to the bubble for their final report. Every incident, every door movement, every camera feed is archived. The day's log might look like this. 6 o'clock count complete, all present. 6:10 breakfast trays distributed. 9:15 inmate D, 2:13 male inspection completed. 11 o'clock recreation. 12:05 return to cell. 1300 hours unit quiet. 1600 hours meal pass. 2000 hours lights dimmed. No violence. No chaos. No incident. Just another day of perfect control. The ethical paradox. To the public, ADX Florence stands as the pinnacle of American prison security, a guarantee that the most dangerous will never harm again. But to human rights observers, it's a paradox, a place that maintains order by erasing the human spirit. According to Amnesty International and the ACLU, prolonged solitary confinement exceeding 15 days constitutes psychological torture under international law. At ADX, most inmates spend years, sometimes decades, in such conditions. Even the Bureau of Prisons eventually acknowledged the mental cost, introducing the step-down program, a gradual process that allows inmates to earn limited privileges and, eventually, transfer to less restrictive units. But progress is slow. For many, the walls are permanent. Nightfall. By midnight, the lights dim once more. The inmate lies awake, staring at the ceiling. He can hear faint mechanical clicks, the hum of the ventilation system, the soft echo of distant doors. No voices. No sound. No life beyond the concrete. He blinks. And for a brief moment, he wonders if he's still part of the world outside these walls, or if that world has already forgotten him. Tomorrow, the same sequence will begin again. And again. And again. The first thing most inmates at ADX learn is that escape isn't the dream, transfer is. They whisper about it in coded letters, hint at it in therapy sessions, cling to it like a religion. The step-down program, that's the phrase carved into every mind that still dares to hope. According to Bureau of Prisons policy memos filed in Bacote v. BOP, 2012, the program was created to provide structured incentives for improved behavior through progressive movement toward general population status. To the public, it sounds humane, a path out of perpetual isolation. Inside, it feels more like a mirage built out of paperwork and promises. The promise. After years in solitary, inmate 92137-058 receives a notice slipped under his door. It's thin, printed in bureaucratic gray, evaluation for step-down eligibility. He reads it twice, unsure if it's real. If approved, he could eventually move from Range 13, the most restrictive housing unit, to a slightly looser one with limited contact, maybe even a television and 5 more minutes of human conversation a week. It sounds like paradise compared to the monotony he's known. But nothing at ADX is given freely. To qualify, he must obey without flaw for 6 consecutive months, no verbal outburst, no disobedience, no sign of defiance. His mail will be monitored, his psychology reports dissected, his movements timed to the second. One misplaced word can send him back to the beginning. The evaluation. At 10 a.m., the slot in his door opens. A counselor's voice comes through the intercom, flat, rehearsed. You've been selected for evaluation. Answer honestly. There's no face-to-face. Only a tablet mounted on the wall, camera fixed on him like an unblinking eye. Questions flash one after another. How do you feel about staff? Have you had any violent thoughts? Do you believe you can function in a less secure environment? He answers carefully, aware that every syllable will be analyzed by psychologists in Washington, D.C., not just Florence. According to BOP Psychological Services Protocol 14-03, evaluators look for what they call behavioral authenticity, proof that compliance isn't an act. But in a place where every emotion is rehearsed for survival, authenticity is the rarest currency. The trade-off. Weeks pass. Nothing changes. Then one morning, he wakes to find a small television mounted behind plexiglass on his wall. No remote, just preset channels, news, education, weather. He knows what this means. He's past the first phase. But the privilege comes with a new rule, constant visibility. The cameras in his cell remain active 24/7. His phone calls are monitored in real time. Every smile, every glance, every note of emotion is logged. The illusion of progress hides a deeper truth: the more freedom you earn, the more closely they watch. The false horizon. Inmates talk about the step-down ladder as if it's a staircase out of hell. In reality, it's a treadmill. 4 phases in total. Control unit, total isolation. Intermediate unit, limited items, occasional therapy. Pre-transfer unit, supervised recreation, monitored group sessions. General population, USP Florence, the final reward. Only a fraction ever reach the 4th. Many never leave phase 1. Court filings in Bacote v. BOP revealed that some inmates remained in the same stage for over a decade, even with perfect disciplinary records. Reasons for denial were often classified as administrative. To appeal was to shout into concrete. The therapy room. Once a week, he's led down a hallway, wrists and ankles cuffed, to what the prison calls a therapeutic intervention cell. It's a small, glass-walled room where he sits on a steel stool, facing a monitor that displays the image of a psychologist hundreds of miles away. How have you been sleeping? Any intrusive thoughts? Do you understand why you're here? He nods. Speaks softly. The answers are simple, almost robotic. He's careful not to sound angry, not to sound broken, not to sound too hopeful. The wrong tone can trigger a notation, unstable effect, not ready for step progression. The irony isn't lost on him. To prove he's sane, he has to act like a machine. The Whisper Network. Despite the silence, information travels inside ADX, through lawyer letters, guard gossip, and mental health sessions overheard down the corridor. He learns that some prisoners faked breakdowns just to get moved to medical units. Others filed lawsuits to attract media attention, hoping exposure would accelerate their transfer. A few succeeded. Most were forgotten. According to investigative journalist Alan Prendergast, more than 400 lawsuits have been filed by ADX inmates since its opening in 1994, the majority centered on mental health neglect and indefinite isolation. Only a handful resulted in policy changes. For the men inside, litigation became the only form of rebellion left. The weight of hope. By his third year, the inmate keeps a small calendar drawn in pencil on the wall. Each square represents a day without incident. He marks them carefully, like counting breaths underwater. One slip, a raised voice, a delay in following orders, can erase the entire grid. That's how ADX turns hope into pressure. It weaponizes anticipation. Prison psychologists know this. Some even admit it privately. One former clinician told frontline investigators, "Hope keeps them compliant. Despair breaks them." The program lives in the space between the two. The meeting. 6 months later, he's summoned again. This time, it's not through a monitor. 2 officials in dark suits appear at his cell, one from the bureau, one from the Psychology Services Division. "Your file's under review," one says. "We need to verify readiness for the next phase." He stands still as they study him, posture, tone, breathing. They ask about remorse, about plans for reintegration. He answers with what he thinks they want to hear. The session lasts 10 minutes. When they leave, he realizes they never once used his name, only his number. The denial. Weeks later, the paper comes again. Not the one he wanted. Evaluation complete, remain in current phase. Reason, behavioral monitoring incomplete. He reads it 3 times before folding it neatly under his mattress. No explanation, no timeline, no appeal. He's back where he started, same walls, same silence, same ceiling. But something inside him has shifted. He no longer believes in the program. He believes only in endurance. The system that needs belief. The step-down program was meant to humanize ADX. Instead, it became its mask. In public hearings, officials cite it as proof of reform. In reality, it keeps the institution alive by dangling the illusion of change, a psychological valve preventing total collapse. Without hope, riots happen. Without control, chaos spreads. So the system learned to combine both, hope as control. According to Harvard Law Review, 2019, fewer than 10% of ADX inmates transitioned to open population facilities in the previous decade. For the rest, the process is indefinite, opaque, and primarily symbolic. Midnight reflection. That night, the inmate lies awake, eyes fixed on the narrow window slit. The sky above is clear, an expanse he can't touch. He counts the blinking red light of the ceiling camera like a heartbeat. He thinks about freedom, but not in the way he used to. Freedom, he realizes, isn't walking outside. It's remembering who you were before they taught you routine. He closes his eyes and whispers a line he once read in a tattered Bible. "The truth shall make you free." Then he laughs, quietly, bitterly. Because in here, truth is the one thing that never gets out. The minds that break and the ones that don't. It's been said that ADX Florence doesn't just confine the body, it erases the mind. But not every mind breaks the same way. Some collapse quietly. Some shatter violently. And a rare few, the ones the Bureau never fully understands, adapt. Inside this labyrinth of concrete and silence, the human psyche becomes both a weapon and a battlefield. The breaking point. At first, the descent is invisible. Inmates stop pacing. Stop talking. Their eyes dull, their movements slow. Weeks turn into months, and the silence begins to whisper back, soft at first, then insistent. A tap in the pipes that isn't there. A shadow that moves when the lights don't. According to psychologists cited in Bacote v. BOP, these are early symptoms of sensory deprivation psychosis, the mind fabricating stimuli to replace the missing world. In cell D-213, inmate 92137-058 has stopped sleeping through the night. He lies awake, tracing every sound, the hum of the vent, the drip of water, the mechanical buzz of the security system resetting every hour. He knows the pattern by heart. When it shifts, even slightly, he feels panic crawl up his spine. He doesn't realize it yet, but his body has developed a rhythm of hypervigilance, a survival mechanism in a place designed to suffocate all instinct. The ones who collapse. Some inmates don't make it that far. One, known publicly only as inmate AH, was described in court filings as psychotically detached after 5 years in solitary. He began to smear words on his walls in soap, verses, numbers, fragments of names. Guards found him one morning speaking to the drain, convinced someone was whispering back. According to Bureau of Prisons records later cited by the Denver Post, AH was eventually transferred to a federal medical facility, but not before multiple suicide attempts and a final diagnosis of irreversible isolation psychosis. He wasn't unique. In fact, ADX's own mental health audits admitted that over 1/3 of its population had documented psychological conditions, many exacerbated by confinement. In the words of one federal psychologist, the environment feeds on itself. You remove all human contact, and what's left tries to build a replacement out of madness. The ones who resist. And then there are the others, the ones who refuse to break. They treat the silence as a challenge, not a curse. They build mental empires out of memory, reciting books they once read, counting in foreign languages, replaying every street they ever walked. One former ADX prisoner, writing anonymously for Solitary Watch, described it like this. If you can't escape the room, you escape inside yourself. The trick is not to let the room follow you there. Inmate 92137-058 becomes one of these survivors. Each morning, he forces his mind into structure. 50 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, 20 squats, mental math drills. Then he imagines walking through his old neighborhood, every storefront, every crack in the pavement, every voice from his past. It's not nostalgia. It's psychological resistance. The prison controls his body, but he won't let it control the space in his head. The psychological war. The Bureau of Prisons knows this mental duel exists, and, in a way, it encourages it. In a 2014 internal memo later cited by Amnesty International, ADX psychologists were instructed to document adaptive resilience patterns, behavioral signs of inmates who showed high psychological endurance. Those individuals were studied, monitored, even profiled as case studies for future Supermax designs. In other words, the prison didn't just punish endurance, it analyzed it. It became a laboratory for control. One former warden, Robert Hood, later said, ADX was built to contain violence. But what it really contains is data on how much the human mind can take. The breaking of routine. After years of absolute structure, even the smallest deviation feels seismic. One afternoon, the fire alarm system misfires, a brief shrill echo that cuts through the stillness. For 10 seconds, chaos exists. Inmate 92137-058 leaps from his bed. Down the hallway, another man screams, a guttural, primal sound that ripples through the concrete. Then, silence again. The alarm stops. For hours afterward, guards record unusual behavior across multiple cells, pacing, muttering, agitation. The event becomes a psychological experiment in real time. What happens when predictability collapses in a place built entirely on it? The answer is simple: control fractures instantly. The case of Silverstein. Every inmate at ADX knows the name Thomas Silverstein. Even though he died in 2019, his legend lives inside these walls like a ghost. Silverstein, once a leader in the Aryan Brotherhood, spent 36 years in solitary confinement, the longest in U.S. history. He was first isolated at Marion after killing a correctional officer, then transferred through various high-security sites before ADX became his final cage. He called his cell a tomb for the living. In his letters, he described learning to control his thoughts like muscles, forcing himself to stay sane by focusing on tiny details, like dust motes or cracks in the wall. "You become both your own jailer and your own prisoner," he wrote. His case inspired both outrage and policy debate. How long could the state keep a man alone before it became cruelty, not justice? The answer, at least for Silverstein, was until his death. The silent conversations. Back in D-213, the inmate starts hearing patterns, faint taps through the concrete. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. He listens closely. It's Morse code, old-school prison language, used decades ago in places like Alcatraz and Levin. The codes of the forgotten. Silence has always been ADX Florence's strongest weapon, but even here, silence eventually cracks. For inmate 92137-058, it happens one night around 2 a.m. He's lying on his slab, staring at the ceiling, when the sound comes again. 3 soft taps. Pause. 2 more. Then silence. At first, he thinks it's nothing. The pipes, the vents, the echo of his own mind. But when it repeats, with the same rhythm, his pulse quickens. It's a message. He taps back, once, twice, an old inmate code he learned years ago in Leavenworth. To his shock, the reply comes instantly. For the first time in years, he's not alone. The language beneath the walls. This is how communication survives inside ADX. It's not spoken. It's engineered, through vibrations, reflections, and rhythm. Prisoners who have never seen each other's faces share thoughts through the very structure meant to separate them. Federal incident logs obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests confirm that despite the soundproof design, inmates have managed to communicate using pipe knock codes, tapping through air vents and even humming into drains that carry faint vibrations down the concrete walls. One internal memo from the Bureau of Prisons referred to it as residual human adaptation. But to the men inside, it's more than that. It's rebellion, proof that connection can't be completely destroyed. The tap network. Over weeks, the taps become sentences. They develop rhythm, timing, meaning. Through the walls, 92,137 learns there are at least 4 others on his range, one old-timer from New York, a former cartel lieutenant, and a man rumored to have ties to foreign intelligence. They call themselves, quietly, the Ghosts. No names. No faces. Just sound. They share news filtered through attorney letters, fragments of what's happening beyond the walls, elections, wars, court rulings. It's fragmented, but it's something. They talk about their cases, their regrets, and, most dangerously, their plans. Because even in the world's most secure prison, the idea of freedom never fully dies. The Watchers. Of course, ADX knows. The control center picks up irregular noise spikes across the D-unit sensors. A report is filed, possible inmate communication, Section 13, cells D-210 through D-214. Within hours, guards sweep the range. They enter each cell, checking pipes, vents, and drains. Inmate 92137 sits motionless, his hands on his knees, eyes calm. He's learned not to react. After 10 minutes, they move on. He waits. Hours pass. Then, faintly, the tapping begins again. The ghosts are still there. The birth of an idea. For the first time since arriving, 92137 begins to feel something dangerous, purpose. He starts documenting every message in his head, memorizing patterns, building a mental map of the network. He learns when guards rotate shifts, when sensors reset, when the ventilation hum drops low enough to hide a sound. In a place designed to crush individuality, he's found the one thing they can't control, timing. According to a declassified Bureau report from 2007, several inmates in ADX's control unit were discovered creating acoustic communication systems so advanced that staff believed they were coordinated by ex-military prisoners. No devices were found, only patterns of synchronized tapping spanning multiple cells. The system was so efficient it earned an internal nickname among staff, the Morse line. The Ghost's Manifesto. Over months, the tapping evolves into more than conversation, it becomes ideology. The ghosts start creating what they call the message, a philosophy about endurance, control, and freedom of mind. Each man contributes a line, a thought, a rule. One taps out. They can lock the doors, but not the truth. Another replies. Walls can't hold what you refuse to surrender. It spreads across the unit, a silent religion of resistance. The prison reacts. Security notices the change. Inmates who once stared blankly at walls now sit straighter, more alert. They follow the rules, but their eyes have life again. And that makes the institution nervous. ADX doesn't fear violence, it fears coherence. A single thought shared among many is the one thing its system isn't built to contain. So the administration tightens control. Recreation time reduced. Mail censored more heavily. Psych evaluations increased. According to the Marshall Project's 2016 report on ADX reform, this exact pattern repeated during multiple lockdowns, a brief rise in inmate morale followed by policy crackdowns aimed at reducing cross-cell influence. The experiment. One day, guards escort 92137 to a different unit. He's told it's for behavioral reassessment. The room is bare, bright lights, a chair bolted to the floor, a camera overhead. A voice comes through an intercom. We're trying a new sound isolation model. Let us know if you experience discomfort. Then they shut the door. For hours, he sits in absolute silence, no hum, no buzz, no echo. The air is still. His heartbeat sounds like thunder in his skull. By the 5th hour, he begins to hallucinate motion in the light. He feels weightless, detached from his own body. When they finally release him, he doesn't remember walking back to his cell. According to documents filed in Bacote v. BOP, acoustic isolation tests were conducted on select high-security inmates in 2011 and 2012 to evaluate mental endurance under controlled deprivation. Officials later denied this practice publicly, but the accounts remain in sealed affidavits. The return. Back in his cell, he feels changed. The silence that once terrified him now feels like something he can manipulate. He starts testing it, humming softly, listening to the echo bounce back from unseen corners. Sound, he realizes, has power here. It's the only living thing left. That night, he sends a message to the ghosts. Still here. The reply comes after a pause, 5 slow knocks, the code for "we hear you." He smiles, a small, defiant thing in a place designed to erase emotion. The evolution of control. The Bureau believes it understands human behavior, but what it's really studying at ADX is evolution under confinement. Each policy meant to suppress adaptation only creates new forms of it. Every silence breeds new ways of speaking. Every rule creates a loophole born of desperation and intellect. In the words of criminologist Karamet Reiter, who studied ADX in depth, Supermax prisons are not just cages, they are laboratories where human endurance is tested against the architecture of control. And in that experiment, the prisoners aren't just subjects. They're evolving organisms in an artificial ecosystem built to kill the soul. Midnight. The lights dim again. Outside, the Colorado desert is black and endless. Inside, the ghosts tap faintly through the walls, a rhythm of survival, rebellion, and memory. To a casual observer, it's meaningless noise. But to those who know, it's the heartbeat of men who refuse to vanish. Inmate 92137-058 listens, smiles, and taps once more. Tomorrow. Disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Information in this chapter is derived from verified sources including Bureau of Prisons FOIA documents, Bacote v. BOP, 2012, filings, The Marshall Project, 2016, Amnesty International reports, and psychological analyses of long-term solitary confinement. The walls of ADX Florence are built to contain danger. But there's one truth that's rarely spoken: the danger leaks both ways. Every day, men in uniform stare into a world most people can't imagine, concrete boxes filled with silence, eyes that never blink, men who have nothing left but their thoughts. And over time, the line between guard and prisoner begins to blur. The bubble. They call it the bubble, a glass room that sits above the cell ranges like an all-seeing tower. From here, the officers control the world. Buttons open doors, close gates, activate cameras. Screens flicker with hundreds of feeds, every inmate, every angle, every second. Behind closed doors, legislators debated expansion. Some argued it was a necessary evil. Others saw it as a monument to American hubris. Yet every new controversy, a prison riot, a terror plot, a high-profile crime, only pushed more funding toward the system that already had too much. One anonymous DOJ official told Politico in 2018. No one ever lost a vote for being too tough on crime. The bureaucracy of shadows. ADX is managed by humans, but governed by paperwork. Every transfer, every privilege, every act of mercy must pass through layers of invisible bureaucracy. Inmates like 92,137 become case numbers shuffled between departments that don't speak the same language: psychological services, special investigative unit, national security liaison. Files disappear. Decisions stall. Lives freeze. The machine doesn't slow down, it waits for no one. One former administrator described it best. The prison isn't run by people anymore. It's run by process. And once a process begins, it never stops. The prison industrial chain. Behind every locked door is an invoice. Every isolation unit is a contract. Every security camera is a line item. Private firms supply everything: food, uniforms, sensors, concrete, software, and even psychological assessments. Each component built by a contractor that profits from the illusion of danger. Critics call it the prison industrial chain, a self-sustaining cycle where punishment becomes commerce and fear becomes policy. The more inmates ADX holds, the more powerful its economic gravity becomes. Even reform advocates quietly admit, dismantling the system would collapse a billion-dollar industry. The illusion of control. For the public, ADX represents the ultimate control over chaos. But inside those walls, control often feels like chaos disguised as order. Prisoners vanish into solitary for decades. Guards lose their sense of self. Politicians build careers on their suffering. And the cycle continues, because silence doesn't argue. The true genius of ADX isn't its walls or its cameras. It's how it turned punishment into policy, and policy into a symbol. The price of power. As night falls over the desert, the lights of Florence shimmer like a small city, powered by fear, funded by politics, and guarded by men who understand neither fully. Inside, 92,137 lies awake, staring at the ceiling. He doesn't know the scale of the system that holds him. He only knows its rhythm, its hum, its silence, its perfect routine. But somewhere above him, in Washington, someone's signature once built the walls that now define his world. Power echoes in strange ways, sometimes through speeches, sometimes through laws, sometimes through the sound of a lock clicking shut 1,000 miles away. And that echo, too, never fades. For decades, ADX Florence stood untouched, a silent fortress built on fear and buried secrets. But walls, no matter how thick, eventually find a way to talk. Sometimes through letters. Sometimes through lawsuits. And sometimes through the cracks left by those who simply refuse to be forgotten. By the 2010s, the world outside began to hear faint echoes from within America's most secure prison, echoes that would force the government to confront the truth it had long tried to contain. The first voices. It began with letters, thin, censored, and heavy with desperation. Each one took weeks to arrive, often covered in black ink from redactions. But within the fragments, there were patterns, stories of men losing their minds in silence, of cells freezing in winter, of lights that never went out. One of the first to break through was a letter from inmate Jack Powers, sent in 2010 to his attorney and later quoted in court filings. "They say this is a prison," Powers wrote. "But it's really a place where you disappear alive." Powers had spent years in isolation for crimes connected to mail fraud and escape attempts, not murder, not terrorism. His crime was defiance. His punishment was silence. He described self-harm, hallucinations, and what he called a war inside the head. The letter became part of a legal complaint that would reach the federal courts, and, eventually, the front page of the New York Times. For the first time, the public read words written from inside a cell no camera had ever filmed. The lawsuit that broke the silence. In 2012, a group of ADX prisoners, led by Powers, Armando Torres, and others, filed a class action lawsuit known as Bacote versus Federal Bureau of Prisons. Their claim: cruel and unusual punishment. Their evidence: years of documented neglect, self-mutilation, and untreated psychosis. The complaint described how inmates were driven to madness by conditions akin to psychological torture. Cells coated in blood, screams echoing through the night, men banging their heads against steel until they passed out. The Bureau initially denied everything. But discovery forced open doors that had stayed shut for 20 years. Internal memos, psychiatric reports, and staff emails revealed that ADX administrators had repeatedly ignored warnings about mental illness. One psychologist wrote in 2009, "We are warehousing broken men and pretending not to see the fractures." When the New York Times published excerpts of the filings, the world reacted with disbelief. The clean version of hell, as one warden once called it, was suddenly visible and ugly. The journalists who listened. Few reporters ever set foot near ADX. But some, driven by curiosity or conscience, spent years chasing the whispers. Among them was Alan Prendergast, an investigative journalist who began covering Supermax prisons long before they were publicly understood. He pieced together testimonies from former staff, leaked disciplinary logs, and court transcripts. In 2013, his series, Out of Sight, Out of Mind, in Westward magazine broke new ground, detailing the invisible epidemic of mental illness at ADX. "You can't reform what you can't see," Prendergast wrote. ADX is built so the nation never has to look at what punishment really means. His work inspired further coverage by PBS Frontline and The Guardian, bringing global attention to the moral question America could no longer ignore. The investigators. Behind closed doors, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division quietly launched internal reviews. The findings, though never fully released, confirmed what prisoners had long claimed. Systemic neglect of mental health, misuse of isolation for administrative convenience, and repeated violations of internal policy. In 2014, under growing legal and political pressure, the Bureau announced reforms: modest, bureaucratic, and, for many, too late. They expanded the step-down program, increased psychiatric staffing, and created what they called the ADX Mental Health Unit. But inside, little changed. Former inmates who later transferred to other facilities said the reforms were cosmetic. The walls still stood, the silence still ruled. The government had admitted a problem, but not the scale of it. The families outside. While the Bureau defended itself in courtrooms, families of ADX prisoners became unexpected activists. Mothers, sisters, and wives began gathering in Denver and Washington, holding signs that read, "End the silence. We are not invisible." They shared stories of letters that stopped arriving, phone calls denied, and loved ones who seemed to vanish into paperless files. One woman told The Guardian, "They say they're protecting the public from dangerous men. But what about the danger of forgetting what mercy looks like?" Their persistence drew attention from civil rights groups, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the ACLU, which began citing ADX Florence as an example of cruelty under democracy. For the first time, the fortress was being questioned not by rebels, but by ordinary citizens. The leaks. In 2017, a former Bureau contractor leaked internal correspondence showing that ADX had conducted suicide risk assessments on inmates who had already died. The reports were labeled retrospective compliance reviews. Another batch of documents revealed that even after court settlements, isolation durations had increased, not decreased. The revelations shocked advocacy groups, reigniting public scrutiny. Federal lawmakers demanded explanations. The Bureau responded with silence. When asked by reporters about ADX's oversight, one official simply said, "The facility functions as designed." And that was precisely the problem. The ghost of litigation. By 2018, Bacote v. BOP had resulted in a partial settlement. The Bureau agreed to improve mental health treatment and re-evaluate long-term solitary confinement cases. It sounded like victory, until lawyers discovered the language of the agreement. It required best efforts, not measurable change. No independent monitors. No transparency. A symbolic reform in a system built on symbols. Still, for the first time, ADX had been forced to acknowledge human suffering inside its walls. That acknowledgement, however small, was a crack, and cracks, once formed, spread. The academic awakening. Universities began studying ADX not as a prison, but as a social experiment. Psychologists called it the architecture of despair. Legal scholars labeled it a constitutional paradox. Students debated whether a free society could justify a place designed to erase freedom completely. Reports by Harvard, Yale, and Stanford researchers began circulating, exposing how the Supermax model had expanded globally, influencing prisons in the UK, Brazil, and Australia. America's shadow had become the world's blueprint. One professor summarized it bluntly. The world learned how to build walls from us. Now we have to learn how to tear them down. The walls crack. In 2019, as part of an investigative review, the Bureau quietly transferred several inmates from ADX to lower security units, including one man who'd spent over 25 years in isolation. The transfer wasn't announced publicly. But inside, inmates noticed. The whisper spread through the walls like an electrical pulse. They're moving people. For men who hadn't touched another human hand in decades, that rumor was revolutionary. Hope returned to the corridors, cautious, fragile, but real. The echo reaches the outside. By 2020, the name, ADX Florence, no longer symbolized power. It symbolized controversy. Talk shows, op-eds, and podcasts began dissecting its legacy. Was it justice, or a monument to America's fear? Was it safety, or cruelty polished into policy? In one televised debate, a former warden admitted, ADX does what it was built to do. The question is whether what it was built to do should exist at all. The end of silence. Back in his cell, inmate 92137-058 presses his hand against the wall. The tapping, the Morse code of the ghosts, has grown quieter. Some of them have been moved. Some have disappeared. Some, perhaps, are finally free. He doesn't know which. But for the first time, he feels the world beyond the walls listening, faintly, distantly, but listening. He closes his eyes and whispers to himself. If they can hear us, maybe they'll remember we're still here. The sound disappears into the concrete, but this time, it doesn't die there. It travels, carried by paper, by newsprint, by the human need to know what happens when a nation buries its own conscience beneath stone. And in that echo, ADX Florence begins to lose the one thing that made it invincible. It's silence. For nearly 3 decades, the gray walls of ADX Florence have stood untouched against the desert wind, a fortress of American justice, a monument to fear, and a question no one wants to answer. The question isn't what happens inside, anymore. It's what does it say about us that it exists at all? Because behind those razor wires and endless corridors lies something far greater than a prison. It's a reflection of a society that built silence and called it safety. The legacy of control. When ADX opened in 1994, it was hailed as a miracle of modern penology, a place where order triumphed over chaos. But as the years passed, it became clear that the price of that order was human. Every policy, every routine, every locked door was designed to create perfect control, a system with no noise, no failure, no unpredictability. And in achieving that perfection, the system became something else entirely, a machine that ran on absence. No riots. No sound. No reform. Just silence, and the illusion of peace. A former warden once said in an interview, ADX doesn't make men better. It just makes them disappear. And in the end, that was its true purpose. The human toll. Over the years, the toll became undeniable. Dozens of inmates died by suicide. Hundreds suffered severe psychological breakdowns. Even guards, the watchers, carried the scars of isolation home with them. Psychiatrists who studied ADX compared its effects to sensory deprivation torture. Brain scans of long-term inmates showed patterns consistent with trauma survivors and war veterans. According to a 2017 Harvard Medical School study, after just 30 days in total isolation, brain activity in the regions responsible for empathy and social processing begins to diminish. At ADX, most men serve years. These are the hidden casualties of silence, invisible, uncounted, and often unacknowledged. The shift in conscience. Something changed in the late 2010s. The myth of absolute control began to lose its power. Lawmakers, judges, and even former correctional officers started to speak differently. They began to use words once unthinkable in the halls of justice: rehabilitation, redemption, humanity. In 2019, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture cited ADX Florence by name as an example of inhumane treatment under international law. For the first time, a U.S. institution, built and defended for its strength, was publicly described as a site of moral failure. That same year, the Bureau quietly reduced the number of inmates in long-term isolation by 20%. It wasn't revolution. But it was the first real sign that the world was starting to look inside. The evolution of justice. The story of ADX Florence mirrors the evolution of American justice itself. From retribution to rehabilitation. From vengeance to reflection. Each era leaves behind its monuments. Prisons, courthouses, policies. But ADX stands apart because it forced a question no law can answer. How far can a nation go to protect itself before it loses what it's protecting? Justice without humanity is efficiency. Punishment without mercy is policy. And a society that forgets the difference becomes a warden of its own conscience. The men who endured. Some of the men who once lived in those cells eventually walked free. They left with haunted eyes, trembling hands, and a knowledge few could bear to hold. One former inmate told The Guardian, "When you spend that long in silence, you stop knowing how to be human. You have to relearn it." He described stepping into sunlight and feeling panic, not joy. Crowds terrified him. Laughter felt alien. Freedom was another kind of cage. Others never made it out. Their names live on in court documents, advocacy reports, and memories shared in whispers by the few who knew them. They are the ghosts of Florence, men who remind the world that silence is never empty. The moral reckoning. Every generation inherits its own version of control. For some, it's surveillance. For others, it's confinement. ADX Florence taught both lessons: that systems built to protect can easily become systems that consume. The world's most secure prison wasn't just a building, it was a philosophy, that safety and freedom cannot coexist. But history has shown that when one is built at the expense of the other, both are lost. From Washington to Geneva, from journalists to activists, the message became clear. Security without humanity is not justice. And once that truth escaped those walls, it could never be locked away again. The desert still watches. Today, Florence still stands. The desert still hums around it, and the wind still whispers through razor wire. The cameras still blink red through the night, and somewhere in those halls, a man still lies awake counting the seconds between mechanical hums. But now, the silence feels different, not eternal, not invincible, just fragile. Because the world knows what it hides. Because the walls, once so proud, now echo with the memory of the voices they tried to bury. The final echo. If you drive past Florence at sunset, the prison almost disappears into the landscape, a shadow merging with stone. You could miss it entirely, unless you knew where to look. But the real prison isn't the concrete. It's the belief that some people deserve to vanish. That safety requires silence. That justice can exist without empathy. The lesson of ADX Florence is simple, brutal, and unforgetting. When we build cages for monsters, we must be careful not to become them. Because the world's most secure prison was never just about who we locked inside. It was about what we locked away in ourselves. Disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Verified information was drawn from Bacote v. BOP, 2012 to 2018, Human Rights Watch, The New York Times, Harvard Medical School, Amnesty International, and Public Bureau of Prison statements. At first, the guards take pride in it. It feels powerful. They're the only moving parts in a system built on stillness. But after months, years, the silence starts to echo back. The officers stop talking as much. They start watching more. And something inside them starts to go quiet too. The long watch. Correctional Officer J. Mercer joined ADX in 2005. He came from a regular penitentiary, loud, chaotic, alive. He thought this would be a promotion. Instead, it became a mirror. In an interview years later with the Denver Post, Mercer said, "At first, you think it's peace. Then you realize it's absence." 8 hours a day, he sat inside the bubble, eyes scanning monitors. No shouting. No fights. No movement. Just men pacing in boxes, day after day, year after year. By his 3rd year, Mercer developed insomnia. By his 5th, panic attacks. Doctors called it secondary confinement syndrome, the same psychological symptoms seen in long-term inmates: hypervigilance, anxiety, emotional numbness. The prison had built a machine that didn't just control prisoners, it controlled the minds of those who ran it. The unseen pressure. Guards at ADX are trained to never show emotion. No sympathy. No reaction. No visible judgment. Because empathy, even for a second, is risk. A crack in the armor of control. Officers rotate posts every few months, but it doesn't help. Many describe the feeling of invisible fatigue. One former sergeant said in a court affidavit, "You can't yell, you can't joke, you can't talk to them like humans. So you start to lose your own humanity." Some turn cold. Others turn cruel. A few, quietly, break the code of silence. Inside the bureau, officers rarely speak publicly about what happens within those walls. Not because they're forbidden, but because no one outside believes them. In 2014, a group of staff filed internal complaints describing psychological degradation and occupational trauma. The documents were quietly sealed under security sensitivity. One anonymous officer told Frontline, "You can't talk about stress in a place built on control. If the inmates can't show weakness, neither can we." The result is an unspoken epidemic, burnout disguised as discipline. The shift change. Every 12 hours, the rotation happens like clockwork. Officers file through security, biometric scans, radio checks, weapon inventory. They pass through 4 gates, each one slamming shut with the sound of finality. It's a reminder, once you're in, you don't leave until the system lets you. Inside, they operate by rhythm: inspection, count, camera check, silence. No one looks each other in the eye for long. No one jokes in front of inmates. The unspoken rule: if you act too human, you're out of sync with the institution. And when that happens, the institution pushes back. The weight of watching. The hardest part isn't the violence. It's the waiting. Guards watch men sit motionless for hours. Sometimes days. They see the mental collapse happen in real time, the rocking, the whispering, the blank stares. But they can't intervene unless policy demands it. Mercer once told a colleague, "It's like watching someone drown in slow motion, and being told not to throw the rope until they stop moving." Those images don't fade. They settle in the mind, layer by layer, like the dust that never leaves the cell blocks. By retirement age, many guards carry symptoms similar to PTSD, flashbacks, insomnia, depression. Yet, officially, the Bureau has never acknowledged the phenomenon. The breaking of boundaries. Not every officer remains detached. Some start bending rules, small gestures of rebellion against the system's inhumanity. A few slip inmates an extra food tray. Others pause a moment longer during mail checks, allowing a prisoner to glimpse a human face. It's dangerous compassion. And it comes at a cost. In 2017, internal investigations documented several staff terminations for unauthorized contact, usually emotional, sometimes romantic, often rooted in shared psychological strain. As one former supervisor put it, "You spend long enough staring into isolation, and eventually, isolation stares back." The moral corrosion. There's a point in every guard's career when they stop seeing inmates as monsters, and start seeing reflections. The Bureau doesn't talk about that moment. It's when the system's logic begins to erode. One veteran lieutenant described it bluntly in a recorded training session. "The thing about ADX is, you think you're maintaining control. But control starts maintaining you." In a facility designed to prevent violence, psychological violence becomes routine, subtle, invisible, constant. Guards begin to measure their success not by reform, not by safety, but by how quiet the range stays. And silence, here, has become the ultimate product. Cracks in the glass. Late at night, when the corridors go dark and the monitors dim, the officers in the bubble sometimes talk, quietly, like confessions. They wonder if the system makes the world safer, or if it just buries what society doesn't want to see. They question the ethics of locking men away until they vanish into their own minds. Then, as quickly as the thoughts surface, they bury them again. By morning, they're back to procedure. Check. Log. Watch. Repeat. Because questioning the system means acknowledging the cost, and that's something no one here is allowed to do. The human cost. The Department of Justice quietly tracks occupational mental health incidents in federal prisons. Though ADX employs fewer than 400 staff, its rate of stress-related medical leave is among the highest in the Bureau. The numbers are redacted in public reports, but whistleblowers have described entire teams cycling through therapy under fake names. The system heals itself by denial. As one counselor said under anonymity, ADX is a place where empathy goes to die, for inmates and officers alike. Night Reflections. At the end of his shift, Mercer stands outside the gate, staring at the horizon. The desert wind feels different after 12 hours behind concrete. He lights a cigarette, even though he quit years ago, and watches the smoke curl into the air. For a moment, he imagines the men still inside, lying awake under fluorescent light. He realizes their view and his aren't that different. One has bars. The other has memories. Both will be there tomorrow. There's a saying among federal staff at Florence, whispered in break rooms and murmured after shift changes. ADX has 3 layers, the one the world sees, the one the Bureau manages, and the one no one talks about. The third layer isn't on any public map. It's where America hides the prisoners it doesn't want history to remember. They call it Range 13. And it's unlike anything else inside the most secure prison on Earth. The unseen corridor. To the untrained eye, Range 13 is just another wing, a sterile hallway lined with reinforced doors, cameras in every corner, no signage. But according to redacted architectural schematics leaked in 2015 through a Freedom of Information Act release, this section was built with triple-insulated walls, independent air ducts, and offline surveillance channels that feed directly to a classified DOJ server in Washington. Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's where the government keeps men whose names still echo in classified briefings and congressional hearings. Here, even the guards don't know who they're watching. Their access is limited to patrol routes, files are redacted, identities coded with 3-letter prefixes. They call the inhabitants the Invisibles. The purpose. Range 13 was conceived in the shadow of September 11, 2001. After the attacks, the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons developed what internal memos labeled Special Administrative Measures, SAMs. These measures restricted communication to near zero, preventing inmates from passing messages to the outside world. ADX Florence became the testing ground. According to court filings from United States v. Elhage, 2002, and Elmazane v. BOP, 2009, prisoners under SAMs were confined to isolated ranges where every letter, phone call, and even legal correspondence was monitored or censored. By 2005, Range 13 was operational, a facility within a facility, where those under permanent SAMs were sealed from all others. The names behind numbers. Some of the world's most notorious figures have reportedly spent years in these cells. Ramzi Youssef, architect of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Zacarias Moussaoui, linked to the 9/11 conspiracy. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. Jakar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. Their files are coded, their routines invisible, their contact list empty. Even their lawyers face restrictions, conversations monitored, notes confiscated, and visits conducted under surveillance glass. A 2013 Human Rights Watch report described it plainly. They live in a world without echo. The isolation equation. In Range 13, the silence is engineered mathematically. Acoustic engineers calculated the reverberation time to be under 0.3 seconds, meaning no sound can travel far enough to be heard by another human being. Light cycles are randomized to prevent inmates from marking time. Mail arrives months late, heavily redacted, sometimes blank. A guard who once worked the range told the Marshall Project. You start to think they're ghosts. You feed them, check the log, move on. You never hear a word. The design achieves the Bureau's ultimate dream, a prisoner who exists without existing. The control of knowledge. Even inside the prison, information about Range 13 is rationed. New officers aren't briefed until they've served 2 years without disciplinary incidents. All staff are required to sign Form 416A, Permanent Non-Disclosure Agreement, Classified Detention Unit. Violating it carries up to 20 years in prison. The Bureau learned this lesson in 2011 when a low-level maintenance worker leaked descriptions of subterranean isolation cells to a journalist. The men disappeared from public record a year later. The story was buried under National Security Classification. The experiment. According to documents uncovered by ProPublica, Range 13 isn't just about punishment, it's about control of information. Officials observed how prolonged sensory deprivation affected not just the prisoner's mind, but his ability to recall, confess, or even trust memory. Psychological specialists from Quantico reportedly conducted assessments, measuring cognitive decay under total isolation. One leaked memo, titled Cognitive Integrity Testing in High-Security Containment, 2007, reads: Extended isolation produces controlled cognitive dissonance, ideal for long-term intelligence containment. To translate, silence can be used as interrogation. The Phantom Guards. Few officers volunteer for Range 13 duty. Those who do are selected for their discretion and their ability to not ask questions. They wear no name tags, use no radios, and never travel in pairs. Orders come in sealed envelopes. Each shift, they record entries like 6 o'clock, inmate awake. No activity. 12 o'clock, lunch issued. Consumed. 1700 hours, lights dimmed. That's it. Days pass like that, bleeding into each other until even the guards lose sense of when they began. One officer, later dismissed for emotional instability, said he'd begun hearing whispers through the intercom system, faint breathing, like someone on the other end listening to him. He wasn't sure if it was real. Neither were his superiors. The forgotten file. In 2019, during a DOJ audit, a file was discovered with no corresponding inmate record, simply labeled Subject 72B. The paper contained only a single paragraph. Transferred from undisclosed facility. Subject under perpetual administrative hold. Identity sealed under National Security Directive 112. No one knew who 72B was. No one asked. According to the audit summary later obtained by The Intercept, when investigators attempted to trace the transfer, no digital trail existed. The entry was eventually redacted from the report. Even within a system built on secrecy, there are ghosts among ghosts. The moral blind spot. To the outside world, ADX Florence is a fortress of justice, a monument to order. But Range 13 is something else entirely. It exists in the gray zone between law and disappearance. No charges, no trials, no witnesses, just men who vanish into paperwork stamped classified. Civil rights groups have tried to challenge it. In 2015, attorneys from the ACLU filed a motion requesting limited access to SAM's prisoners. The motion was denied on grounds of national security risk. One line in the court order stands out. Certain forms of knowledge are, by definition, dangerous to possess. The final wall. Some say the Bureau designed Range 13 to be the endpoint, the place where the human need for contact finally breaks. But they miscalculated one thing: even buried, people leave traces. Maintenance logs, brief power surges, unexplained camera malfunctions, small anomalies that suggest movement, agency, survival. Maybe it's electrical interference. Maybe it's the ghosts of the living. Either way, Range 13 hums beneath the surface, unseen, unheard, but undeniably alive. Midnight in the core. Far below the rest of the prison, a single light glows behind steel glass. The camera feed is dark, but if you stare long enough, you can almost see a silhouette, a man sitting perfectly still, eyes open, waiting. Somewhere in the walls above him, a faint vibration travels upward, too soft to record, too human to erase. Even here, in the buried heart of America's most secret prison, silence has a pulse. ADX Florence was never just a prison. It was a message. A political statement carved into the Colorado desert, cold, absolute, and unmistakable. Every slab of concrete, every camera, Every bolt in its steel doors exists not only to contain violence but to symbolize control. To understand ADX, you have to look beyond its walls, into the offices of Washington, the boardrooms of private contractors, and the headlines that kept the fear alive. The birth of a symbol. When the prison opened in 1994, the U.S. was deep in a new era of crime rhetoric. Politicians promised zero tolerance, 3 strikes, and super predators. But beneath the slogans was a quieter strategy: create a prison so extreme, so untouchable, that it would silence critics who called the justice system soft. Senators toured the facility before it opened. Press releases called it the ultimate deterrent. Media dubbed it America's Vault of Evil. And behind the public theater, funding flowed like never before. According to Government Accountability Office records, GAO 96-41, construction costs for ADX exceeded $60 million, nearly double early estimates. But that was just the beginning. Over the next decade, its budget would balloon, hidden under national security appropriations. ADX became more than a prison. It became a political brand. The fear economy. Every era of fear creates an economy, and ADX was its marketplace. After September 11th, as the War on Terror swept across the globe, the Bureau of Prisons found itself with a new currency: security. The more dangerous the world seemed, the more money it received. Budgets for high-security infrastructure tripled between 2001 and 2009. Private contractors, surveillance firms, construction companies, and behavioral analysis consultants followed the money trail straight to Florence. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Wackenhut began supplying everything from biometric locks to behavioral modeling software used to predict inmate aggression. Each upgrade brought new contracts, new funding, new influence. Each expansion tightened the invisible loop between politics and profit. ADX wasn't just built to contain America's worst criminals, it was built to justify its own existence. The War on the Invisible. By the early 2000s, Washington had learned that fear could move votes. And nothing symbolized fear more effectively than men locked away forever: terrorists, cartel lords, domestic radicals. The narrative was simple. We're safe because they're buried. But as the years went by, the definition of "they" expanded. Court documents from Ashker versus Governor and Bacote v. BOP show that dozens of inmates placed under long-term isolation were not global terrorists or cartel leaders, but low-level offenders with mental illnesses, or those who had simply fought back against abuse. They weren't threats to the nation. They were threats to the illusion of order. Still, the system labeled them the same way: unmanageable, non-compliant, security risk. The politics of fear doesn't distinguish, it categorizes. The media machine. The press played its part. Television specials, magazine spreads, documentaries, all showing ADX as a fortress where evil met its end. Headlines like, "Inside the Hell Built for Monsters," or "Florence, Where Terror Sleeps," dominated primetime news. Few journalists were allowed inside, and those who were, came out with heavily censored footage and government-approved talking points. The Bureau understood that mystery breeds myth, and myth breeds support. So they fed the legend. Even critics became part of the performance. When Amnesty International called ADX a place that should not exist in a democracy, politicians used that very quote to prove how far they'd go to protect freedom. In America, outrage sells, and both sides cashed in. The hidden economics of isolation. Each cell at ADX costs roughly $80,000 per inmate per year to maintain, nearly 3 times the cost of housing a federal inmate elsewhere. The reason? Technology and staff overhead, cameras, control systems, health monitoring, psychological screening. Every motion is automated, every guard trained for crisis-level security, even when there is no crisis. Critics from the Harvard Criminal Justice Policy Review called it a bureaucracy addicted to its own precautions. Each improvement justified another layer of funding. Each layer of funding made the system too profitable to question. Supermax prisons spread across the country: Illinois, California, Arizona, each modeled after Florence, each sold to the public as essential. A network of high-security facilities grew under the same principle: the more isolation you build, the safer people feel, whether or not it's true. The political theater. In Washington, ADX became shorthand for toughness. Presidents, senators, and attorney generals invoked it whenever they needed to project control. "Send them to Florence" became a catchphrase on Capitol Hill, not because it solved anything, but because it sounded final.